The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Welcome to the IT Governance webinar, 5 Steps to a Successful Risk Assessment. That is a risk assessment according to ISO 27001, the specification for an information security management system. I'm with you for something approaching an hour, in which we will be discussing the specific requirements of ISO 27001 related to information security risk assessment, and then management systems in general and risk-based thinking. We'll touch on that no doubt at some stage, and going well beyond the risk assessment requirements into risk treatment and risk management generally, which I suspect many of you may expect us to cover as we're going through the session. I'll be pulling on my something approaching, if not exceeding, oh dear, yeah, exceeding 20 years of experience in dealing with information security management systems and the knowledge we've gained through IT governance supporting many organizations in implementing information security management systems. If you have questions, please use the chat feature in GoToWebinar. You should have the option of submitting through that chat feature questions if you wish. I will either, if I notice them, I'll answer them as we go. If not, I'll come back to them at the end, and certainly there's an opportunity right at the very end of the session for you to raise questions as you see fit. Talking a little bit about me and what I'm covering, why I'm covering this. This is a bit of my background. Those of you that were with us for the session on the 17th of May will be familiar with these first few slides as we go through an introduction. So I'm an executive director at IT Governance, where we provide a one-stop shop or a single source of solutions and services to help you meet your information and IT governance, risk management and compliance requirements. I happen to be the chair of the UK ISO IEC 27001 user group. We're given the title, the standard, almost its full reference there. ISO and IEC, two standards organizations. The fact that it's ISO/IEC means that both of those standards organizations recognize the one with a unique reference of 27001 as being the standard for an information security management system. I'll come back to that. I happen to chair IST 33, which in the UK is our national standards bodies committee that shadows or mirrors, rather, is probably the appropriate word, mirrors the international committee SC27, SC27 being the subcommittee 27 of Joint Technical Committee 1, JTC1. SC27 is responsible for the creation, publication, maintenance, upkeep, and in due course, I guess, retiring and archiving, withdrawal that is, of international standards in the information security arena. Certainly 27001 being its most popular. that along with 27000, 27002, and still ISO 27005. I'll talk about some of those other standards I've just listed as we go through the session today. I'm a technical assessor, contracted to UCAS as a technical assessor for the Information Security Management System scheme, and also for the ISO 20000, so whether you call that the IT Service Management System or just a Service Management System, either of those. I go out on behalf of UCAS and assess certification bodies, accredited certification bodies, or that's their intent, against the requirements of the accredited certification scheme, making sure that they are suitably independent, impartial, competent, allow sufficient time for audits, all of that good stuff, so that anyone that looks at or receives an accredited certificate, a UCAS accredited certificate, has some confidence in it and has an understanding of the degree of check and challenge that has been provided to the management system in order for the certificate to be awarded. So I'm in a, I guess, privileged position of getting to have a look at how a number of certification bodies approach this issue. I'm also the author with Alan Calder, our chief exec and founder here at IT Governance, co-authored the book that effectively gave life to the company, I guess. The book being, or the current version being, IT Governance and International Guide to Data Security and ISO 27001/27002, and a few others besides. But that's enough of me. Let's talk very briefly about IT governance. We cover these sorts of disciplines in our services, products, training courses, standards, books, and various other means by which we support and help organizations and individuals with their needs in the information governance, risk management and compliance arena. You will see in there are a number of standards referenced, ISO standards being international, and of course there's a number of British standards and other national standards that we also help organizations with. One of the most popular we're finding right now, or a lot of interest in, is the British standard 10,012. That's a specification for a personal information management system, and as you can guess by that title, the driver for the interest, we believe, around privacy is EU GDPR, although we might be something like approaching maybe a week late for us to be discussing that in also to be discussing that in any real detail. Not late, of course, because the requirements apply going forwards. The 25th of May was a big date for that, as I'm sure you are aware. Right, returning to today's discussion, what will we be touching on? Well, we'll be going through the following. We'll be talking about the requirements in ISO 27001 for a risk management framework of some description, or the implications of 27001 for a risk management framework. Identifying the risks to the ISMS, the Information Security Management System, a requirement of section 6.1.1 of the standard. A lot of organizations and implementers overlook that as a separate requirement to that for an information security risk assessment. So there is a section 6.1.1 of the standard, a requirement that the organization considers risks to the information security management system in achieving its objectives, and there is a requirement at 6.1.2 that the organization conducts an information security risk assessment, and that goes on to 6.1.3 that talks about risk treatment, and then 6.2, of course, you've got objectives which align typically to the risk assessment and risk treatment decisions. Talking of decisions, that brings us on nicely to taking risk decisions and choosing risk treatment options. We'll be discussing that and touching briefly on the requirements in 27001 for documented information and what you do afterwards. I've mentioned some clause numbers there from section 6 of the standard. Of course, it's not only section 6 of ISO 27001:2013 that reflects on information security risk and risk assessment and risk management. It's also sections 8.2 and 8.3. More of those as we move through the webinar. Those that were with me on the 17th of May will recognise this slide, and no apology for repeating it. It's massively important that we are all clear, please, on the three but related different aspects of people's mindset when they're thinking about ISO 27001. ISO 27001 itself is a standard. It's a specification, a set of requirements against which organizations can both design their ISMS and have their ISMS compared. But 27001 is a standard or a specification. An ISMS is an information security management system that can be designed to meet the requirements of ISO 27001. It's a means of working, a set of arrangements, considerations, structures, organizational structures, configurations, and the like. And then there is accredited certification. This is a means of being independently audited and a certificate of attestation effectively being issued, reflecting conformity to the requirements of 27001, and that's the conformity of your ISMS to meeting those requirements. So a lot of individuals or and users of the standard refer to 27001, whereas actually they are typically meaning the information security management system and or accredited certification, whereas 27001 itself is simply the document that contains the requirements for an information security management system. To be an effective ISMS, the arrangements need to address and consider all three of these key areas. No surprises here, and of course, in considering and safeguarding the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of information and information-related assets and systems. Just reflecting back on what I've just said, an information security management system includes things such as the organizational structure, people, processes, policies, resources, networks, configurations, software, hardware, etc. It's a lot more than the documentation that many people are actually referring to when they reference an ISMS. An information security management system designed in accordance with 27001 majors on risk management as a means of achieving the appropriate balance of controls and arrangements around and relating to people, processes, and technology to safeguard the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of information appropriate to the organization that's deploying the ISMS. Those words about being appropriate to the organization deploying the ISMS are massively important throughout the entire standard, and specifically on the aspects relating to risk management. The risk management, the context of the organization, the risk management has to reflect and respect that context. Otherwise, the outputs of the entire risk process and hence the resulting ISMS will not be fit for purpose, will not serve the organization well. So on a point of terminology, returning to almost the title of the session we're going through today, what is a risk assessment? Well, it's a means of identifying, analysing and evaluating risk. The risk assessment activity produces a set of results that informs a decision going forwards. So on the second bullet here, where we've got, for the sake of putting it on the slide, I'd suggest that it determines the actions that should be taken. I challenge that. If we were being very pedantic about it, I'd suggest actually the risk assessment informs the decisions that determine the actions and controls to manage risks. So it certainly has a key role in informing the appropriate set of controls and measures that an organization wants to put in place. And that's really important to bear in mind throughout the entire session that we're going through today, and with your approach to information security, risk assessment and management. Many organizations get very bogged down in the detail of the information security risk assessment, and some never actually complete it. The intent of the information security risk assessment is that it informs the stance, your security stance, the security stance of the ISMS. And so completing, yes, a complete and yes, a thorough information security risk assessment, but actually completing it is really important, because you want to complete it and feel the benefit of it. If the risk methodology is overly complex, detailed, or demanding, resource demanding, then I'm afraid it's not going to serve your organization well. It's massively important to remember that, of course, you don't only do the risk assessment once. I've already made reference to sections 8.2 and 8.3 of the standard. They require that you come back at planned intervals, or when there are proposed or actual changes that occur, significant changes that occur, that the information security risk assessment is revisited and updated, which means, of course, that the resulting risk treatment plan will also be updated to reflect the new sets of arrangements and drivers and requirements. So keeping the risk assessment in its place, almost not letting it overcome the rest of the project and stifle the rest of the project, is massively important, but also completing it in sufficient detail and thoroughness that it does serve the organization well. Getting that balance can be very important, but also challenging. The risk assessment, as it says on the slide here, informs the balance and deployment of controls, specific controls and blends of controls, to deliver a controlled risk environment that the organization's happy to live with going forwards. It's absolutely core to the center of ISO 27001, and indeed risk-based thinking is fundamental to pretty much every other management system standard. If you look at management system standards, and including 27001, wherever it mentions as appropriate, that typically references risk-based thinking. Specifically in 27001, we have the requirements around information security, risk assessment and management, which magnifies that significantly. With regards to the controls, 27001 provides some candidate controls under 14 headings or categories. These 14 headings are can be useful, but at the same time they can also lead individuals to misunderstand the meaning and breadth of the controls beneath each of them. Indeed, the control titles themselves can lead to some confusion. Many of the controls, if you read the guidance in the guidance document ISO 27002, you will find that the applicability and scope of any one of the 114 controls under these 14 control categories or control sets, any one of them typically stands well beyond that you might first imagine, going by its title and solely its title. These are just some of the options. The standard itself, of course, requires that once you've been through the risk assessment process and you've determined the controls you require, and we will talk about the process that gets you to that stage throughout this webinar. When you get to that stage, you are required to compare the controls you've identified from any source you desire, and indeed, if you wish to make your own controls up, compare them against those in Annex A to make sure that you haven't inappropriately omitted any. Let's get back to that risk assessment framework. So establishing a risk management framework. Reflecting on the webinar session last month, which will be available to you, by the way, following today's session, each of you that are logged in will receive an email with links to for you to access both this slide deck, and you can also link through to the session delivered on the 17th of May, which was delivering an ISO 27001 project time and budget. So this session here is very focused on step 6, so positioning this in a 27001 implementation or ISMS implementation project to deliver conformity to ISO 27001, if we want to be correct. This is step 6, so you'd have already established the project, the project mandate, the project initiation, resources required, a project team, that sort of thing, identified the drivers, the objectives, have the basic management system framework in place that enables some of the fundamentals such as document control and continual improvement to be in place. Because let's face it, when you complete a risk assessment and get as far as a risk treatment plan, delivering that risk treatment plan, that is improvement. It's massively important that you capture that. We often see organisations that have gone it alone, so to speak, getting as far as just short of a certification audit, thinking, how do we demonstrate continual improvement? Because they've left continual improvement to the very last aspect of their implementation or their project plan, because improvement section 10 in the standard, and they've addressed 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and 9 beforehand. Well, do section 10 first. Get a mechanism for helping you deliver improvement consistently, and you capture the evidence in the meantime, early in the process. And then, of course, when you determine your risk treatment plan, you can feed that through the improvement mechanism to deliver those improvements, and you're capturing the evidence of it at the same time. So we're at stage 6, if you recall what we went through and was with us mid-May. At stage 6, we need to determine a risk management framework. 4 aspects on this slide relating to a risk management framework. First off, determining a method. It's important when you're determining a method to know what your end goal is and where you are going with your risk assessment. The fact that actually you do want to complete the risk assessment and start benefiting from the decisions it's enabled you to make. And that's what the risk assessment's about. It's forward-looking, it's crystal ball gazing. It's let's crack on, get the risk assessment done so we can start using it to inform the improvements we want to apply. It depends massively on having risk scales defined, and those scales will often vary organisation by organisation, reflecting the importance or respective importances of preserving, safeguarding the confidentiality, integrity and availability of the organisation's assets. Those scales reflect the business and nature of the organisation, and on the consequence scale it should be configured or constructed so that it enables the organisation to consider the entire consequence of a risk coming about. Once you've got a method defined, and the method needs to derive and produce consistent, valid and comparable results. 3 really important words there: consistent, valid and comparable results in order to be in conformity with 27001. Once you've got that method and you've got the scales defined, it enables the organisation to determine its risk appetite, and that can be described in a number of ways. But once the organisation has its method, its scales and its risk appetite or its tolerance defined, decisions can be made and the benefits can be derived. The number 4 on this slide is contracts, legislation and regulatory requirements. meeting those drivers, typically contextual issues identified as information security relevant requirements from interested parties with regards to an ISMS. One train of thought is that these needs to be satisfied anyway, as a management system objective is to satisfy contractual, legal and regulatory obligations, and therefore it might well come under 6.1.1 and considering risks in relation to the ISMS achieving its objectives. Another train of thought is that contractual, legislative and regulatory compliance should be factored more directly into the consequence of risks coming about with regards to an information security risk assessment. Either way, a management system needs to consider it, and your risk method should define a consistent way of approaching that, I would suggest. Once an organization identifies its scales and its method, of course, it identifies the consequences of confidentiality, integrity and availability being compromised. It identifies the likelihood of the events that lead to that being the case coming about, and risk is a factor of the two. I have seen various equations of a wide spread of complexities as to how risk is calculated as a value of or factor of likelihood and consequence. Of course, 27001 has no such requirement for or no requirement for an equation. It simply says that risk is a factor of both, and the determined risk needs to be exactly that, consistent, valid and comparable. So as long as it happens on that basis, you could indeed use a matrix such as that on the slide shown here and simply require that people look up the risk level subject to how the consequence and likelihood scales have been defined and the figures estimated for any specific risk and the aspects or constituents of that risk. So we need to identify risks to the ISMS. There's many ways of identifying these risks and many different approaches. However, whatever approach your organization adopts will typically relate to the complexity of the method you deploy. The standard itself, 27001, indicates that an ISMS and its size and complexity should be proportionate to the organization and the complexity and size of the information security challenge it is designed to meet. Guidance is available in the form of ISO 27005 as an international standard. The published version of ISO 27005 is currently aligned to the old version of 27001. So 27005 is yet to be, but should soon be tweaked slightly to reflect that 27001 2013 is more flexible with regards to information security risk assessment and management. And in the UK, there is a British standard, BS 7799 Part 3, that fully reflects the flexibility in 27001 2013. BS 7799 Part 3 was published in 2017 as a British standard, and I'm slightly biased given my role in standards and standardization, but I tend to think it's a useful document with some valuable content in there. This slide just gives you an indication of some of what might be seen as the more complex, or some of the considerations in a slightly more complex approach to thinking about risk scenarios and risk estimations. This is based on the Osaka Risk IT framework. You don't have to identify all of these as long as you're approach, a method, produces consistent, valid and comparable results. Have I said that enough yet? I've said it a few times. Massively important. So you do, with your risk methodology, other than producing those things, consistent, valid and comparable results, it does need to be suitably comprehensive, and therefore I would suggest you need to include at least these things. In fact, many more. In our experience, many organizations and individuals, when trying to design and complete an information security risk assessment according to 27001, default to headline grabbing incidents, such as terrorist attacks and international cyber warfare and the like. Typically, it's the less obvious, dare I say, more boring issues that are more likely and more directly within your sphere of influence to prevent that you can really benefit from focusing on. Of course, you need to consider the other issues, the headline grabbing issues, and make sure you have arrangements in place for what you do should they come about, but you're less likely to be able to influence the likelihood or direct consequence of them if and when they come about. You're more likely to be able to ensure that your recovery mechanisms are in place so that you can get back up and running and manage the consequences when it does occur. It's the less obvious and more local issues that you can start working to prevent with other controls. So some of the more obvious ones in that category are falling foul to social engineering and phishing attacks, or CEO, email fraud, those sorts of issues. And so a number of organizations provide services of phishing tests where you can determine how effective your awareness and communications and education of your users has been by sending out test emails and seeing just how many of them click through inappropriately. Coming back to this information security risk assessment in a bit more detail, let's talk about actually conducting the risk assessment. Well, that's going to depend on your methodology. So the key decisions with regards to methodology are whether you adopt a quantitative or qualitative approach. Typically, a quantitative approach assigns exact figures, and a qualitative approach assigns bands or labels to bands of levels of pain or consequence and likelihood. This is defined for both, and the degree of detail depends on your ISMS, your organization, the complexity and risks associated with it. A high-level broad brush approach being described on the left here, and a more detailed, thorough approach on the right. Of course, a more detailed, thorough approach gives you a much more insightful and detailed risk treatment plan. However, if it takes too long to complete or is too challenging, you may never get to the stage where you benefit from all the effort put into the risk assessment because you drown in your information security risk assessment. I've already made reference to the requirements at sections 8.2 and 8.3 of the standard that once you've completed the risk assessment the first time, ideally using the same method, you need to revisit it at planned intervals or when significant changes are proposed or do occur. Bear with me just one moment. I'm going to take a swig of water. So echoing back to my commentary on risk scales earlier, and the need to consider all consequences, your consequence scale needs to factor in all of the negatives of something coming about, and causing disruption or pain to the organisation, and reflecting the drivers and issues for the organisation and its context. In fact, whilst I'm talking about context is that important that the accredited certification scheme requires that scope statements for certification documents, so certificates issued implying conformity to 27001 and other management system standards, have to be clear and unambiguous with regards to the type of activities, products and services that are in the scope, without being misleading or ambiguous. That contextual requirement at section 4 feeds through the entire standard and indeed scheme, given that it's the context that's reflected in a scope statement or on a certificate that's issued for conforming to 27001. It needs to consider all of the negative aspects, so your consequence scale needs to factor in things such as negative media coverage, reputational damage, those sorts of things, and consider, of course, not just confidentiality being compromised, but integrity and availability also. We frequently find the availability aspect is a useful hook for selling the benefits of an ISMS to senior management. So back to that risk assessment and the scale. What if CI and A are compromised? Well, this is one way of potentially describing a 5-level scale of minor through to catastrophic. And of course, your descriptions of these should be made clear, the description of each, so that anyone involved in the information security risk assessment has a similar understanding of each of those levels of consequence to drive that consistency across the entire ISMS risk activity. Once the consequence total is determined, it's a factor of this and the likelihood value that determines the risk. The scales, once defined along with the risk method, help inform what is seen as a tolerable risk or a risk appetite, a risk acceptance criteria, against which the evaluated risks will be compared, and that will inform the risk decision, which nicely brings us on to the next section, taking decisions and choosing risk treatment options. Let's have a look at these. Typically, most of us recognize 4 options for treating risks. They are to accept the risk, share the risk, treat the risk, or avoid the risk. In the guidance documents, and borrowing from the British standard 7799 part 3, that actually lists 7 options. So it talks about avoiding the risk, i.e. stopping the activity or not starting the activity that gives rise to the risk in the first place. Taking or increasing the risk, that tends to happen where there is an opportunity, and it's recognized that the likelihood of the opportunity being realized and the extent of that opportunity is such that it warrants taking or increasing an identified risk. That's the second one. The third one is removing the source of the risk. Frequently not within the control of an organization, certainly for the headline grabbing scenarios that I touched on a few slides back, but removing the source of a risk is potentially a solution or an answer. The next 2 are more obvious: change the likelihood, change the consequences. 2 options there, both directly or frequently directly a result of applying controls. Share the risk. Well, actually sharing the risk through insurance or through the supply chain, that indeed in 27001 parlance, when you think about control category A15, supplier relationships, that is again applying controls effectively, or can be. And retaining the risk, recognizing the risk and knowingly accepting it. So they're the 7 options that you will find if you invest in a copy of BS 7799 Part 3, for most of us and for most risk methodologies, it's recognizing 4 ways to treat a risk, or indeed a blend of any of those 4 ways to treating a risk. And a blend of those controls, instead of relying on a single control, is highly preferable, on the basis that should one fail, the others should still be there, so you don't instantly default back to the nightmare risk scenario that you may have identified at the outset. And ideally, your mechanism for monitoring controls and their effectiveness identifies that one of them has failed before any of the others do, so that you can react to that and return your risk profile back to where it should be prior to exposing yourself to a much greater risk than just the one control failing. So moving on beyond the risk assessment aspect of the title of this webinar, let's consider reporting and following up. 27001, the standard requires that records of the information security risk assessment and information security risk treatment processes are maintained. And it goes on after that to talk about the production of a statement of applicability. We'll return to that in just a moment. Reacting to risks requires communication, and it should, I would suggest, be part of your risk treatment plan and your ISMS, as well as being part of one of the requirements in section 7 for support. Risk communication should indeed be part of your risk treatment plan. And just reflecting back on those 4 options that we saw earlier, there's a bit more detail here as to how modification, retention, avoidance and sharing could be considered and deployed in your risk treatment plan. Your risk treatment plan effectively becomes, in your initial ISMS implementation project plan, the let's get on and do the information security controls, the risk treatment plan informing that. When you come to the requirement for internal audit, when your internal auditors, whether they're internal or external, you can indeed contract your internal audit service or requirements out to a provider or a consultancy practice. When you're doing that, the auditors, when auditing information security controls, should be looking as much, if not more, at the drivers for the deployment of the control, so the risk treatment plan and the context of the organization, as the guidance on things to consider when implementing the control in 27002. If you want a bit more insight into that approach to audit that I've just described, I would suggest ISO 27007, published in 2017, which is auditing an ISMS. ISO 27007, that is worth a look. So 4 options there, and I'm suggesting that auditors should be aware of those and the risk treatment plan when auditing controls. Moving on to the SOA, Statement of Applicability, is my use of the acronym SOA, not service-oriented architecture. Different course, different webinar. So under clause 613 of 27001/2013, an SOA, a statement of applicability, needs to be produced. And the scheme as it is today, the accredited certification scheme as it is today, results in the specific version of the statement of applicability that is in place at the certification audit that is mentioned on the certificate. The certificate, the statement of applicability rather, details which controls have been determined as necessary for the ISMS. It doesn't need or have to reflect on how those controls have been implemented, simply that the controls have been determined as necessary, justification for their selection, justification for their exclusion if they're being excluded, and to reflect on their implementation status. And hence you can see on this slide how that might come about. Of course, it might not just be what we refer to in our implementation methodology here at IT Governance, baseline security criteria or risk treatment. It could also be simply that in conducting the comparison of the selected controls against those in Annex A to ensure any haven't been inappropriately omitted, that identifies that actually they should have been included. So that might be another column, the check and challenge, if you want, according to part of 6.1.3, I believe. So a record of your information security risk assessment, a record of your information security risk treatment and processes, and at the end of that you're producing a statement of applicability. I made reference to the fact that a certification document includes the specific version of the statement of applicability that the certification body audited you to, or that was in place at the time of their audit. If your statement of applicability is reissued to reflect a new selection of controls, then the certification body, when they are informed of that or notice that, are required to reissue the certificate with a new reflecting the new version of the SOA. However, if the statement of applicability is reissued for a reason other than a variation in the selection of controls, they do not and are not required to, by the scheme, to reissue the certificate. The theory being that that might simply be a change in the implementation status, for example, or a change in the way you're presenting it. It's the determination of controls that informs whether the certificate has to be updated or not to reflect a change in the specific version of the SOA. I would suggest, therefore, that possibly maintaining a change history of your statement of applicability could be worthwhile. And that's another tip to take away from the session today. That's getting towards, if not beyond, certainly the title of our session today, where we've been looking to cover 5 steps to a successful risk assessment, information security risk assessment. We've gone through risk treatment and talked about risk management, risk methodologies as a whole. Most of the content and details that we have touched on, I have touched on, have been pulled from material that's contained in, along with much, much more, of course, that's contained in our training courses, publicly available for in-house and online learning, and increasingly as distance learning options. Bear with me one moment. So training courses that are available, typically delivered by practitioners that have real coalface experience to be able to share with the delegates. If your training budget's already been allocated for the coming year, then there are, of course, other ways in which we can help and assist. You can buy standards from IT Governance. I've mentioned a few of them. The last one I think I mentioned was 27007, Auditing Information Security Management Systems, the 2017 version, worth investing in, I'd suggest. We have books, guides, documentation toolkits, policies, software solutions, and the like. When you get this through, you'll find there's all sorts of links there for you to go through to the relevant pages on our website as and when. I should have mentioned on the previous slide that there are some savings there if you want to buy combi courses. Sorry about flipping back there just for a moment. And there is also, when you get the slide deck through, the option to join me for a discussion around ensuring a successful 27001 certification audit. We will be looking at the value of accredited certification, the experience of accredited certification, the consistency in performance of certification bodies and how that's driven, and indeed the difference between some certification bodies and the flexibility certification bodies have that they can offer and execute in delivering 27001 accredited certification. So that's pretty much the end of what I intended to cover today. The option now is for you to ask some questions, please, using the chat feature on GoToWebinar if you can. I'm going to just go silent for a minute or two so that I can take some more water in. And if any of you would like to post questions on the chat feature, please do. I've had just one question. It's asking how do we have a British standard for the same topic as is covered in an international standard? So there's BS 7799 Part 3, and there is ISO 27005, both addressing the information security risk management requirements of ISO 27001, providing guidance on those. So any national standards body is responsible for what it adopts and publishes as its own national standard. In the UK, that's BSI, and when BSI publishes a document, it has the acronym BS at the start of it, British Standard 7799 in this case. When international standards are published, each national standard body has typically the option to determine whether to adopt it as a national standard or retain or maintain, publish and stick with their own national standard. In many cases, national standards bodies do indeed adopt the international standard. In some, very few, but some cases where, for example, in Europe, if the standard is issued with an acronym in the middle of EN, so ISO 27001 being an example, it is EN in Europe, ISO/IEC 27001. That means that members of CENELEC have to, so the national standards bodies that sign up to that organisation have to adopt it as the national standard. So in the UK, ISO 27001, to give it its full reference as a national standard, is BS EN ISO IEC 27001 as its full reference. So in the UK, the scenario we're at is we have BS 7799 Part 3, that's -3 if you're looking to write it down in short form. BS 7799-3 is the national standard for information security risk management guidance, and ISO 27001 is the international standard for information security risk management guidance. BSI have decided to go down that route for reasons that are, I believe, reflected in the introduction to 7799 Part 3, and I think it's largely driven by the fact that 27005 has yet to be updated to reflect the 2013 version and the flexibility that the 2013 version of 27001 introduces. I think that hopefully that answers that question. Are there any more questions, please? Okay, there's nothing coming in. I'm going to draw it to a close there. I thank you for your time. I hope you found it useful and interesting. I hope you are able to join me at the session where we look at accredited certification and ensuring a successful outcome of your certification audit on the 28th of June. The link to sign up for that will be circulated with access to these slides, and indeed a link so that you can review or revisit the session from the 17th of May. Thank you very much, and I hope to speak to you in a few weeks' time. Cheers.